As the world was somehow watching tensions rise between the United States and NATO ally Denmark, more on that next week, the war in Ukraine crossed a grisly milestone. I've long argued that from a defence economics perspective, the war in Ukraine had the right components to turn into a multi-year grinding struggle. And on January 11th, 2026, the war reached its 1,418th day since the Russian invasion in February 2022, making the short, sharp special military operation longer than the Great Patriotic War, the component of World War II stretching from the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union to Allied victory in Europe. And yet, despite constant discussions of a peace process, planners and the general public in both Russia and Ukraine appear to be digging in for another year of war. And so today, I want to look at the state of the two countries, assess how their war economies and situations changed over the course of 2025, and try and identify some of the biggest risks they face to their national endurance as the war drags into 2026. To do that, I'll start with a brief refresher on some of the indicators we might look at to assess the endurance of a nation in the midst of a war, splitting those into military indicators like losses and equipment reserves that we'll talk about in a future episode, and those that are more diplomatically and geopolitically focused. Then, for both Russia and Ukraine, we'll go through those indicators, asking three key questions. What changed in 2025? Where do things stand now? And what are some of the key risk points to watch going into 2026? Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a sponsor. So let me welcome back a long-term sponsor of the channel, Ground News. As you may have noticed, the first part of 2026 has been rather eventful, and that might make the ability to quickly scan headlines or get different views on an emerging story all the more valuable. If you look at this headline about the United States boarding and seizing a sanctioned tanker, for example, that's all the information you really get. But others can add critical context. This one notes it's the 6th Venezuelan-linked tanker seized by the United States, while this one notes that the tanker, the Veronica, was seized without incident. The tool being used to make that quick comparison is Ground News. It reportedly draws on thousands of news sources around the world to enable you to quickly scan headlines, click through the main article itself if you'd like to read it in full, while also potentially getting a little extra context behind that coverage. Here, for example, you can see factuality ratings based on the work of different news rating organisations, as well as one of my favourites, if you don't recognise the source, ownership information. Beyond that, Ground News also provides you with a range of features to enable you to customise or broaden your experience. You can hone in on particular topics of interest, or embrace something like the blind spot feed, which you can use to surface news items that are overwhelmingly being covered by sources you might not ordinarily consume. As I've said in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean they're good sources or not, but in an era of online echo chambers, I think it can sometimes be useful to get a sense of what other parts of the internet might be reading. And it's one of the reasons why I've been happy to have Ground News as this channel's longest running sponsors. And so if you are interested, the link in the description will give you access to a 40% discount on a Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use. And so with my thanks to them as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so how do we normally go about assessing the potential endurance of a nation and an economy at war? The big reminder up front is that no item of data is ever going to give you a definitive answer there. History is replete with examples of nations that look like they're circling the economic drain but manage to fight on regardless. And on the flip side, countries where a lot of indicators still look relatively strong that nonetheless experience a sudden military or political collapse. If we are looking for clues though, there are two main modes of failure, if you like, that can sometimes force a nation to bow out of a conflict, one way or another. The first is a collapse in the military situation. Maybe you exhaust your material or manpower, maybe morale collapses, and you end up in a situation where battlefield conditions force a government to concede. In a war of attrition like the one in Ukraine, this can be a major concern, and it's one we'll go over the future when we summarise equipment losses, defence production, and the way the manpower and force quality picture for both sides evolved through 2025 in a future episode. But it's also possible for the home front to collapse before the front does. Maybe the economic cost becomes too great, public support fractures, or a government concludes that the likely value of fighting on isn't worth the geopolitical losses being taken elsewhere. This is where we're going to focus today, with the major risk points being economic exhaustions for whatever reason, including the opposing strike campaign, a loss of domestic support or stability, or a change in geopolitical conditions that shifts the calculus and makes it more difficult for a government to justify carrying on a war. So let's start by taking that set of risk points, economics, domestic stability, and geopolitical risk, and apply it to Russia. How did each of those points evolve over the course of 2025, and what do they look like going into 2026? Starting with the economics, I think it was abundantly clear even partway into 2025 that that was going to be the year we witnessed Russia transitioning from the sugar high of wartime stimulus to starting to manifest that strain of maintaining a protracted war effort while under international sanctions and various forms of economic pressure. After strong growth in 2024 from that sugar hit of military spending, by July, the head of the Russian central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, was warning of more turbulent times ahead. And in what must be cold comfort for Russian economic planners, as we move into 2026, it appears she once again managed to call it correctly, with the key factor being that when you look at the indicators for Russia's critical oil and gas sector, just about the only line that went up over the course of the year was the number of Ukrainian drone attacks. The amount of crude oil being delivered to Russia's refineries fell to the lowest level in 15 years. Roughly a 2% drop on 2024 levels, due to what Russian media described as, quote, unscheduled maintenance at refineries following a series of external factors, end quote. With said external factors mostly coming, one imagines, in roughly drone-shaped form. What the 2026 numbers look like remains an open question, both because we don't know the likely cadence of Ukrainian attacks yet, more on those later, but also because one of the big methods the Russians have used to maintain refinery volumes despite attacks hitting refineries has been to defer maintenance and activate what would otherwise be idle capacity. In the short to medium term, that can be massively useful in terms of maintaining total output, but it's also mechanically just not the kind of thing you want to be doing forever. According to Russia's official figures, overall crude oil production was also down for the year, but the major financial difference wasn't in how much oil Russia was producing, but instead a massive decline in what they were being paid for it. You'll remember early in the war when the price cap on Russian oil was first established, it was set at $60 a barrel. And that was considered low enough that Russia went to the effort of using the shadow fleet to try and evade that cap. As of 19 January 2026, the Federal Tax Service of Russia indicated that, quote, the average price level for Ural's crude oil is $39.18 a barrel, attributing that figure to the official website of the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. Now, that value is significantly lower than some others you might see because there are various ways to price a barrel of oil. But the general trend is that the pricing of Russian oil was under a lot of pressure in 2025. Key buyers like India were being pushed to purchase less of it. The transportation system, the shadow fleet, was under threat. And in certain markets, the discount for Russian oil as compared to various international benchmarks got fairly steep. One of the key impacts of a lower oil price was that despite tax hikes, the Russian state just brought in less revenue from oil and gas. An interesting part of the problem here is that as the US dollar price per barrel was being pushed down over the course of 2025, for various reasons, the nominal value of the ruble was being pushed up, gaining about 30% between December 2024 and December 2025, meaning the number of rubles that Russia was getting and could tax per barrel was going down even faster than the US dollar price. Meaning in ruble terms, the value of that oil fell by more than 50% over the course of the year. The cost of producing and shipping that oil, meanwhile, not so much. The current Russian budget for 2026 predicts bringing about 24% less in terms of oil and gas revenue in 2026 than they did in 2025. And if current pricing patterns held through the year, they'd fail to hit even that, which is potentially problematic when, for a long time, oil and gas has been essentially the atlas of the Russian economy, so often holding up other sectors. GDP predictions for the Russian economy as a whole, then, tend to now be much, much lower than they were in previous years. While Russian ministries tend to predict higher values, the IMF revised its estimate for Russian growth in 2025 down to 0.6%. In 2026, they currently expect a slight improvement to 0.8%. Notably, despite the fact that deficit spending continues to rise and wartime stimulus is still growing. Under the hood, though, of this overarching story of slow but continuing economic growth in the midst of a war, I think there's reason to believe we shouldn't take the Russian economic story to be that simple. You could, for example, selectively hone in on negative indicators. Russian manufacturing activity actually fell in the latter part of 2025, for example, which is usually not the kind of thing you see from an industrial nation in the midst of a war. During the Second World War, for example, Germany and Japan were continuing to ramp up wartime output well after the Allied bombing campaigns had kicked off. So if you look just at that, you might conclude the Russian economy is doing worse than the headline figures might suggest. On the flip side, at least according to official figures, Russian inflation is finally starting to come under control. In November, Rosstat claimed an inflation rate about 6% year on year, a significant fall from the 9.5% to 10% we were seeing in 2024, suggesting that despite all the collateral damage caused, those high interest rates we've seen from the Russian Central Bank, which continue to hover around that 16% range, are having the intended effect. And so rather than trying to pick specific indicators to speak to the health of the Russian economy as a whole, I think it's perhaps more accurate to talk about a two-speed economy. One where you don't actually have one large Russian economy growing very slowly despite wartime stimulus. You have a bunch of wartime-specific industries and economic activity that are holding the overall stats up. Noting I would include things like sanction busting and substitution in that category because they really only exist because of wartime conditions. Meanwhile, many parts of, if you like, the regular economy continue to be choked out. A classic example here might be vehicle manufacturing. You remember manufacturing activity in Russia overall was down slightly, but in a lot of cases, that's just a composite of military production that might be up by a lot and civilian production that might be down by a lot. Over 2025, for example, we saw a major Russian car manufacturer reduce production from about 500,000 vehicles to 300,000. At the same time, a major source of additional revenue for the Russian budget was new tariffs on vehicles imported from China, which have been taking greater and greater market share in Russia to the detriment of some of Russia's local manufacturers. There are similar stories in the aviation sector. If you're manufacturing military equipment and the resources are going to be there to produce output no matter what, perhaps unsurprisingly, your output might be on an upward trend. For example, it's reported that last year, the VKS received 7 new batches of Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers. And while we don't have exact numbers, most of those deliveries are believed to consist of 2 or sometimes 3 aircraft. So call it at least 21 aircraft for the year, putting the Sukhoi 34 line on roughly the same level as the French Rafale line. Civilian aircraft production, though, looks very different. Once sanctions snapped into place in 2022, the Russian government came up with a plan to produce a surge of new Russian-manufactured passenger jets to offset Western types. To paraphrase the article on the right there, industry was meant to produce about 127 new civilian aircraft of various types in 2023 through 2025, but ultimately they only managed to produce 12 Sukhoi Superjets, as well as a single new Tupolev Tu-14 that wasn't even used for civil aviation purposes, reportedly instead being used by Russian Deputy Prime Minister Manturov. And what we've often seen those kind of production shortfalls or sanction-induced difficulties cause is Russian firms taking steps that, yes, constitute economic activity in the here and now, but would be considered malinvestment if there wasn't a war on, and might lose a lot of their economic value if the war ever ends. Resources have been dedicated, for example, to providing Russian airlines with a number of mothballed Soviet and Russian-made aircraft. Those aircraft probably wouldn't have a chance in the market if Boeings and Airbuses were still freely available, and it's hard to imagine them remaining cost-effective in service if those Airbuses and Boeings ever make it back into the Russian market. But in the here and now, this is an example of the way a sector of the Russian economy might be trying to hold it together. While a lot of that might be economically painful for Russia and the Russian economy longer term though, in the shorter term, a greater concern for Ukraine and its supporters is probably the ability of the Russian government to continue paying for the war while also holding up the economy. And there, by the Russians' own numbers, the situation has deteriorated, but it's still a long way from being impossible. Russia's deputy finance minister recently said that the budget dynamics in 2026 would broadly mirror those of 2025, where Russia ran a significant deficit, but in a, quote, more acute form, end quote. For reference, in 2025, Russia had originally targeted a deficit of about 0.5% of GDP, which was then slightly overshot, more than 5xing over the course of the year to 2.6%. Whether 2026 sees a similar blowout remains to be seen. That said, Russia's overall government debt levels remain relatively low by global standards. They may not have access to many international capital markets, but there's always the option of going to the Russian banking system and giving them a tap on the shoulder and some helpful suggestions as to where to deploy capital, or an extremist potentially volunteering private Russian savings into government bonds. The big fiscal cushion so far, though, has been Russia's foreign exchange and gold reserves. And while those have been run down, they're still very much there. According to the Russian Finance Ministry, as of late 2025, there was still about $50 billion left in liquid assets in the National Wealth Fund, basically Russia's piggy bank. As at time of recording, that fund's selling mostly Chinese yuan and gold from its reserves at a rate of about $165 million worth per day. At that rate, you'd expect what's left to last about a year. In practice, based on where waves of government expenditure tend to fall across the calendar year, if nothing changes, you'd probably expect it to last longer than that. It's also worth noting the National Wealth Fund is far from the only asset the Russian government can potentially draw on, and while there would be consequences for doing so, a lot of those assets could potentially be raided to help cover the costs of the war. Realistically, it's important to remember that actually bankrupting a country like Russia is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Meaning when you're talking about a wartime scenario like this, the goal for an opponent is often not going to be to collapse, but rather to coerce. Moscow still has the financial resources necessary to carry on this war through 2026. A lot of the costs involved in doing that are longer term in nature. They're gnawing away at the future of the Russian economy, not its present. But as long as Russia decides that long-term pain is worth sustaining the short-term grind, they can probably keep patching it together. Even by the Russian government's own admissions, though, those costs are mounting and things are getting worse, with how much worse they get being driven by a range of factors that we're going to have to keep an eye on in 2026. A big one is how much the Russian government is going to have to step in to bail out various entities, banks, companies, local governments, etc. A key approach of the Russians to keeping deficits down during the war so far has been to take a lot of the costs associated with the war and just push them onto someone else. Local governments, banks that have to write loans to war-related businesses that probably don't deserve those loans. Or companies and sometimes government-owned entities that have been told to take on costs associated with the war without being compensated by the government. These create different balloons of debts and deficits across the economy, and the question always is, how many of them might pop or threaten to pop in any given year? A classic example here would be Russia's state-owned railway system. Russia is a massive country, and a big part of the solution the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union came up with to dealing with the logistics of all of that territory is to build an absolutely massive railway network. Russian Railways employs something like 700,000 people and has about 85,000 kilometres of track. And when the invasion kicked off in February 2022, that massive logistics system activated and to a great extent did what the Russians and Soviets had built it to do. It pivoted to transporting troops and military cargo. It supported the war effort. It moved enormous quantities of men, material, machinery and munitions, and is one of the main reasons why Russian logistics in Ukraine have held together as well as they have. The problem is that prioritisation and those wartime activities come with a cost. Sometimes that's delaying or cancelling civilian traffic. It's missing out on profit-making opportunities. It's losing previously profitable cargo routes carrying exports to Europe, and it's diminished access to critical imports from abroad. A lot of that cost, though, doesn't get directly borne by the Russian budget. It gets hidden on the balance sheet of an increasingly unprofitable railway system, to the tune of roughly $51 billion worth of debt at a time where official interest rates in Russia are about 16%. Even for a company with the kind of assets that Russia's railways have, that's probably not sustainable forever. But it's clearly sustainable for at least a while. And so a major question going into 2026 is when debt balloons like that in Russian railways or the banking sector or various parts of the war and civilian economy are ultimately going to look like they're going to pop, at which point the Russian government typically does one of two things. Either they step in with a rescue package the way they did for the coal sector and you finally start to see some of these externalised costs appear on the government balance sheet. Or, perhaps more likely in a lot of cases, they take the debt bubble and merge it into an even larger debt bubble. If your state-owned railways are in distress, you find a state-owned bank and force them to lend them money at preferential rates. Of course, that just moves the question to when someone's going to have to bail that bank out now that they have a bunch of likely bad debt on their books. But by following that kind of debt-shifting approach, you can kick the economic can for some time. It's just that each subsequent kick is harder and doesn't get you quite as far as the previous one. And so in 2026, it's possible we might see a couple of things fray around the edges. Then there are two major external threat points. One in terms of broader geopolitical developments we'll get to in a moment, and the other a little more direct. Let's talk about the effects of Ukraine's long-range strike campaign. In terms of Ukraine's strike efforts against the Russian economy, we saw plenty of developments in 2025, most of which arguably weren't particularly pleasant for Moscow, but not all of which are particularly easy to assess. One thing we do have at least some data on, though, is the extent to which the scale of the effort has changed. If you'll remember, back in 2022 and 2023, a Ukrainian long-range drone entering Russian territory might be a newsworthy headline all of itself. In 2025, going into 2026, it became a daily three-figure exercise. In terms of numbers, the figures we have from the Russians and Ukrainians obviously differ, but they both point in the same direction. Towards the end of the year, for example, the Ukrainian firm Firepoint, which obviously has an interest in promoting itself as a manufacturer of drones, suggests that it was making about 200 long-range strike drones a day. They indicated a belief that that was about 60% of the overall Ukrainian total, which suggests a Ukrainian production figure of about 330 a day. For their part, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims to have shot down 4,300 Ukrainian drones over Russian territory in December alone, roughly 145 per day. Now, despite the Russian MOD's proven historical proclivity for destroying Ukrainian equipment that cannot and does not exist, I think we're relatively safe treating that Russian figure as a kind of soft floor. We wouldn't expect every Ukrainian one-way attack drone to be used against targets in Russian territory, which is what the Russians appear to be counting here, nor would we expect every one to be shot down. So if we assume the Ukrainian incentive is to inflate their numbers, making their figure the soft cap, I think we'd be safe making at least a low-confident estimate that towards the end of 2025, Ukrainian one-way attack drone production was somewhere between that 140 and 330 a day mark, which would suggest that even at the lower end of that estimate, the one given by the Russian MOD, the number of one-way attack drones launched in both directions might have been relatively similar, which, if so, would represent an interesting reversal in this area, since Russia got its early advantage with the introduction of the Iranian Shahed in the first place. Other changes to the Ukrainian drone effort over the last year, though, other than just continuously adding more drones, are easy to notice but hard to assess. We know that Ukraine has continually, for example, introduced new, more expensive, more capable types. Various jet-powered one-way attack drones that straddle that gap between what is a small cruise missile and what is a one-way attack drone. Larger, more refined systems with better navigation and larger warheads. with the major change being that the Ukrainians, like the Russians, have clearly added the ability for at least some of their systems to incorporate cameras and be manually piloted. We know that because at this stage we have a growing catalogue of video evidence of the Ukrainians using one-way attack drones, often FP1s or FP2s, to attack military Russian targets like air defence systems. What is harder to assess, and what the Russians haven't made clear, is what the relevant mix is. We know, for example, that most attacking Russian drones are still relatively simple, lower-cost types. Gerber decoys or propeller-powered Shahed versions, not the more expensive, blingy jet-powered ones. I think we should probably assume the same is on the Ukrainian side, with this being a mostly low-cost with some high-value mix, but I think it's important to flag that uncertainty over the mix exists, and that we're not sure where it's going to go in 2026 either. And I think that's particularly relevant because one of the areas where the Ukrainian inventory still greatly lags the Russian ones is with regards to those higher-end systems. Functionally speaking, it looks like Ukraine has mostly managed to catch up, at least for now, when it comes to the long-range attack drones. What they've historically been missing, which the Russians have, are those more complex threats, cruise and ballistic missiles to mix into their salvos, take advantage of the exhaustion and the distraction caused by the drones, in order to hit harder and high-value targets. For targets at least out to a couple of hundred kilometres, originally Storm Shadow and ATACMS were partial answers to that problem, but they were always going to be temporary, limited solutions. The US provided the ATACMS it was willing to provide, and there were only ever so many Storm Shadows or Scalps to go around. Going into 2025, there were a number of Ukrainian efforts in this area that had a lot of hype around them. Some of those have subsequently delivered, at least to some extent, some of them not so much. We do, for example, have good video evidence of the Ukrainians firing an extended-range version of their anti-ship missile, the so-called Long Neptune, against Russian ground targets. As an adaptation of an existing system, that was probably the lowest technical risk option the Ukrainians had. And as far as we can tell, so far it has been useful and the Ukrainians were able to fire it from a truck-based launcher, with the major issues still being basically what you'd expect. A limited range, limited availability, and not being as difficult to intercept as something like a ballistic missile. Through 2025, Ukraine's domestically manufactured ballistic missiles, what would be the equivalent to the Russian Iskander, which has proven so effective in Russian service, kind of sat in a very interesting information warfare space, to the point where I find myself disagreeing with some of the statements made by both the Russians and Ukrainians. The Ukrainians claim that at least some domestically built Sapsan ballistic missiles have been fired against Russian targets, successfully. The Russians, meanwhile, periodically claim to shoot down Ukrainian TBMs, usually identified as Trim-2. But so far as an analyst, in terms of hard evidence of missile wreckage, a crater, launch footage, interception footage, satellite after-effect imagery, you name it, Ukraine's TBMs remain a bit of a ghost. A morale booster for the Ukrainians, an excuse when things go wrong for the Russians, but not something with much provable, demonstrable military impact, which you'd expect them to have if they were available in significant numbers and worked as intended. TBMs are dangerous and hard to intercept, so if they were available in significant numbers, I think the odds are that we'd notice. Which suggests to me that if these things are in active Ukrainian service, production volumes are still likely quite low, and we'll see if that changes in 2026. There is one Ukrainian ballistic missile program, though, that might give the Russians particular concern, although it's much more of a long-term one. Through the not at all ominously named Project Nightfall, it was recently announced that the UK and Ukraine will be jointly developing a new TBM. The stated requirement is for a system that sounds awfully like we have Iskander at home, a 200-kilogram warhead carried up to 500 kilometres with a circular error probable of no more than 10 metres. The stated requirement also appears to be for the system to be vehicle-mounted, so we're probably looking for a mobile TEL that can pull off the ballistic missile equivalent of a shoot and scoot attack. The missile is also intended to be relatively low cost, with a stated maximum price per unit of £800,000. If you were going through a Russian demilitarization of Ukraine checklist, that one missile program arguably touches about all the pain points. All of Russia's peace proposals, including the ones put forward in Turkey, required Ukraine to give up its long-range weapon systems. That probably doesn't include a system which, if you snuck it close enough to the border, would be able to just make it to Moscow. Perhaps more comfortably so if they're understating the range, or the Ukrainians were willing to go a little bit lighter on the warhead. Cost and accessibility would also be issues for the Kremlin. All else being equal, Russia obviously doesn't want Ukraine to have any long-range weapons, but if they did have them, it would probably be better from a Russian perspective if they were foreign-designed, foreign-supplied weapons, rather than something the Ukrainians themselves had helped develop and could potentially produce. The main consolation prizes for Russia here, though, are the timelines and the production quantities. Nightfall is only meant to go into testing this year, not mass production, and when it does go into production, the initial target is apparently only 10 missiles a month, with the capacity to scale up further. So while Nightfall might eventually help balance the scales, in the here and now, the Ukrainians have to work with what they got. The broad takeaway there then is that Ukraine's ability to directly inflict damage on the Russian economy significantly increased over the course of 2025. That included not just old standbys like militarily relevant targets like drone factories or ammunition depots, but also economically sensitive ones like oil refineries, storages and tankers. But while Ukraine has been able to ramp up the hit rate and the amount of economic damage it's able to do, what we don't really have any evidence for is those Ukrainian strikes or the mounting economic costs seriously denting Russian internal stability. Public opinion polling in Russia is always a complicated exercise, especially if a pollster has reason to be concerned that respondents are telling them not what they think, but what they think they should think. But acknowledging the limitations of the data, what we do have suggests the Russian public is more ambivalent than anything about the status of the war. Russian state-controlled pollsters indicate that 55% of the Russian population expect the war to end in 2026 and express the desire to return to what they describe as a normal life. But if you make the question more specific and start asking Russians what they'd be willing to give up in order to end the war, it looks a lot less like an anti-war movement and more like a pro-Ukrainian surrender movement. According to the polling you can see on screen there, the proportion of Russian respondents saying they believe negotiations should be entered into to end the war is the highest it's been since the start of the conflict, about 66%. But at the same time, polling also seems to suggest a reluctance to give back to Ukraine any of the territories that have been taken from it, and also, at least as far as the polls are concerned, a degree of optimism about the way the war is going. One poll I found suggested 67% of Russian respondents thought the special military operation was generally going well, up against 23% who thought it was going badly. That's actually a more optimistic result, if you like, than the same poll 5 months earlier, when only 61% of respondents said they thought things were going well. So while Ukrainian drone attacks might be up, that doesn't necessarily mean war optimism among the Russian population has gone down. And for the moment, I'd say the best prediction we could make is that if the war does end in 2026, it probably won't be because of pressure from the general Russian population. I would suggest, though, that there are at least 2 points that indicate the Russian government might think there's a limit here. The first is that in the Russian budget for 2026 that we've seen, in percentage terms, the military budget is far from the fastest growing item. Defence spending is actually meant to decrease 4% year on year, which seems like a very optimistic take if the war continues, and so I think we can press X to doubt on that one. But despite cuts being made virtually everywhere else, including nominally to the war effort, internal security spending is reportedly meant to jump by about 11%. To be fair, part of that might be dealing with threats like Ukrainian sabotage. But to me, it also serves as a bit of a budgetary clue that when push comes to shove, the Kremlin is actively choosing to prioritise internal threats as opposed to external Ukrainian ones. The other clue is that we haven't seen another public mobilisation in Russia since 2022. They've employed various indirect and expensive legal recruitment workarounds to try and fill the ranks, rather than take the cheaper and more efficient but publicly unpopular step of just drafting people into the ranks. To me, again, that suggests that while the domestic situation in Russia might be at least mostly stable, the Kremlin is still nervous about public opinion and is willing to risk significant military and economic utility in order to avoid testing it. In that sense, then, some of the more serious risks for Russia going into 2026 are much more externally focused. Militarily, that means the Ukrainians and how much damage they're able to do. But I also think it's worth acknowledging the limits of Russia's geopolitical position. As much as Russia sometimes acts like a great power and clearly has a lot more economic and military resources than the Ukrainians do, including nuclear weapons, economically, I'd argue they're a major power, not a great one. And we've seen very clearly the extent to which their ability to continue fighting this war really depends on some of the decisions made by other major and great powers. In 2026 then, that might mean watching countries like the PRC and India, for a lot of reasons, including the fact that to date, it's been them absorbing a lot of Russia's hydrocarbon exports. For the last couple of years, the implicit deal there has been relatively simple. Those countries get access to Russian energy for the kind of prices you'd normally only get if you had the seller at gunpoint, which in economic terms they arguably do, and in exchange, Russian oil and gas at least gets a buyer. That situation is not guaranteed to persist though, with it being entirely possible for those countries at any given time to become more or less generous in their approach. In the last week or so, for example, it's been reported that Indian refiners might be cutting back on their Russian oil buys and shifting more to suppliers in the Middle East, potentially against the backdrop of India trying to negotiate a new trade agreement with the United States. Similarly, Russia is kind of at the economic mercy of some of the oil producers out there in OPEC+. They could potentially benefit Russia by deciding to chop back on supply to try and push up the global price. But so far, major players like the Saudis appear to be downplaying any talk of a global oil glut, and have been happy to keep pumping even against the backdrop of lower global prices. A core point here is the Russian budget is incredibly dependent on the price the country is able to get for its oil and gas. But it's other countries, not Moscow, that get to decide how much alternative supply there is in the market and how many buyers out there are willing to purchase Russian product. Even if you move away from looking at major and great powers though, one of the challenges for Russia through 2025 and a risk point going into 2026 is that the Russia Friendship Club has lost a couple of members, and Russia's credibility as a security exporter has taken a couple of hits. In late 2024, early 2025, they lost Assad in Syria. After the events of the last couple of weeks, it's also probably fair to say they've lost Maduro's Venezuela. Not necessarily because his government has been replaced, it hasn't, but rather because the leaders who remain in Caracas probably have less reason to be confident in their Russian air defence systems or assurances of support from Moscow, and considerably more confidence in Washington's ability to add them to the involuntary immigration list if cooperation isn't forthcoming. In 2026 then, from a Russian perspective, I think there are at least two geopolitical risk points to watch. The first is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has been a weapons supplier to Russia, an ally in the Middle East, a customer for Russian weapon exports, and a willing participant in sanctions busting. While Tehran might have reason to think it didn't always get a fantastic deal out of its relationship with Moscow, especially via the deterring military action by Israel, from a Russian perspective, Iran is still a key regional asset. But with their economy in meltdown, I doubt planners in Moscow will be taking Iran's ongoing friendship as a given. And then, potentially even more significant from the point of view of the war in Ukraine, is what we've seen and what we might see from elections in Europe. Many versions you'll hear of the Russian theory of victory ultimately depend on Ukraine being cut off from significant support. Alternatively, a lot of the scenarios where this war goes very badly for Russia is where Ukraine is significantly and sustainably supplied. With the United States withdrawing most of its support, a lot then comes down to Europe, which makes elections in European powers, especially within the EU or NATO, of particular interest to Russia. In 2025, there were at least three that Moscow would have been watching very closely. One that probably went the way that Moscow would have liked, and two that didn't. After an election, the Czech Republic's pro-Ukraine Prime Minister was replaced by the re-election of populist billionaire Andrej Babiš. That mattered because the Czechs had been, and continue to be, major arms suppliers to Ukraine. As with the changeover in the United States, the re-election of Babiš doesn't appear to have stopped the flow of weapons from Prague to Kyiv, but it has meant an end to Prague funding aid, and the loss of a friendly voice in European circles. In the other two cases to mention, Romania and Moldova, a broadly pro-European candidate matched up against a more pro-Russian one. The vote in Romania was important because it prevented another potential pro-Russian blocking force being elected into the European system, while the narrow victory of the pro-EU candidate in Moldova meant, among other things, that that country is likely to maintain its path towards the European Union, and that the Russian-backed enclave of Transnistria, where the Russian Federation still has troops, remains wedged between a deeply hostile Ukraine and a pro-European Moldova, rather than having the pressure eased through the election of a potentially more friendly candidate in Chisinau. But the first few months of 2026 are arguably going to bring an election that's even higher stakes from a Russian perspective. Hungary's Viktor Orbán, who's been Prime Minister of the country since 2010, he's also been one of the most pro-Russian voices among European leaders and one of the most consistent blocking forces in the European Union. Under his leadership, Hungary has been reluctant to transition away from Russian energy. Budapest was one of the original blocking voices against the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO. He's also been a regular critic of President Zelensky, a staunch opponent of aid to Ukraine, and a key factor in delaying or frustrating efforts in Europe to do everything from place additional sanctions on Russia to providing additional assistance to Ukraine. And in April, he's facing an election. And in Orbán's case, it's likely to be a complicated one. Hungary's economy is in fairly dismal shape, and Orbán's had his fair share of corruption scandals. In some recent polling, his primary opponent, a former member of his own party, has recorded a roughly 9-point lead, down from 12 not that long ago. But Orbán is nothing if not a political survivor, and he has extensive control of the country's media ecosystem. And so it'll only be come April where we know which way the ballot box ultimately swings. With, along with the political future of Hungary itself, Moscow's potential loss of a friendly veto within European circles potentially being on the table. And then there's one final category of geopolitical risk to talk about, one that I introduced last week. To a great extent, Russia's financial hydrocarbon lifeline depends on the effective operation of the Shadow Fleet. And the effective operation of that fleet, like many logistical enterprises, depends on people not yoinking its transports. In just the last month, the US has seized more than half a dozen tankers. The Italians grabbed a freighter, the British talked about getting into the game, and presumably not to be outdone by London, Paris went ahead and grabbed one first, with the French boarding the accused Shadow Fleet tanker Grinch, which according to them was likely flying a false flag, and thus fair game. The question for Russia here then is twofold. How far are various countries willing to push their campaign against the Shadow Fleet as it currently exists? And will they be willing to continue such actions when parts of the Shadow Fleet become somewhat less shadowy and start openly flying the Russian flag? An apt summary for Russia, then, is that over the course of 2025, what happened is the economic and geopolitical costs of the war continued to mount. Damage from Ukrainian strikes massively ramped up, the deficit exploded, the economy slowed, and the compounding effects of multiple acts of economic can-kicking can now be seen across a two-speed economy that's pockmarked with significant debt loads at high interest rates. But, despite all that, Moscow is managing to hold it together. And while the cost of doing that continues to increase over time, especially with oil prices as low as they are, it seems likely Russia will economically be able to continue to sustain the war through 2026, as long as the Kremlin is willing to make the necessary sacrifices, and geopolitical events don't poke too many holes in the Russian wartime economic model. Where then, in relative terms, does that leave Ukraine? After all, with its smaller population and economy, and a lot of the fighting taking place on its territory, Ukrainian society has long been paying a huge price to fight this war, in many ways, even before February 2022. But despite the exhaustion that years of fighting quite understandably must bring, as we enter 2026, the Ukrainians are clearly still fighting. Although much like Russia, they face their own pain and risk points in 2025, and more going into 2026. The main ones I want to cover are geopolitical risk, so potential loss of support from Ukraine's allies and supporters, the Ukrainian war economy, and with it, pressure from Russia's ongoing drone and missile campaign, and what that's meant for both Ukraine's fiscal and domestic stability. Namely, whether the government has the funding it needs to carry on the fight, and whether the Ukrainian people still have the will to do so. The reason why with Ukraine, unlike Russia, I want to start with geopolitical risk here is because it's never been realistic for Ukraine to fight a sustained war with Russia using only its domestic resources. Those can go a long way and be incredibly important, but in the end, the Ukrainian wartime economic model depends on foreign assistance, which obviously means it can be deeply sensitive to changes in those support levels. A potential failure condition for Ukraine then would be ever getting to the point where they lose the support of both of their major international backers, the European NATO members and the United States. Going into 2025, it was clear that at least one of those two was in significant danger. And as we'll see in some charts a little later on, ultimately most American aid did disappear. Previously pledged aid continued to arrive and intelligence sharing mostly continued. But for the most part, Washington transitioned from being a financial and military backer of Ukraine to more of an arms seller, willing to supply weapon systems and munitions, but only as long as someone else was going to pay for it. Interestingly, according to some of the polling I've seen, support from the American public for assistance to Ukraine didn't disappear. By some measures, it actually jumped during 2025, with one November poll finding 64% of American respondents in favour of military aid. But ultimately, polls don't set policy. Governments do. And so Ukraine's ability to carry on in 2025 really depended on support from its European backers holding together. And for the most part, that appears to be what happened. What you can see on the right there are the results of the Eurobarometer poll on EU assistance to Ukraine, comparing results from March-April 2025 to the much later ones in October-November. And the broad takeaway is despite the geopolitical earthquakes playing out around the world, for the most part, the results didn't really budge. Financial assistance and economic sanctions on Russia remained overwhelmingly popular, and the ratio of those supporting versus opposing military assistance to Ukrainians hovered between roughly 1.6 to 1 in March and April, as compared to 1.5 to 1 in October-November. A number of European capitals also appear to have taken very deliberate steps to minimise the number of areas where Ukraine remains overwhelmingly reliant on the United States. In early 2025, for example, a major point of concern was American intelligence sharing, providing the Ukrainians with satellite images and a range of other intelligence to enable their operations. But as of last week, the French president claimed that Paris is now providing about 2/3 of the intelligence that was previously overwhelmingly American. From the outside looking in, that's the kind of claim that's almost impossible to verify. And until we see the Ukrainians fire off a missile, only for it to end up in an empty field in the UK or Germany, it's probably hard for us to conclude just how much French targeting data, for example, might be in use. But I do think it's fair to suggest that indicates at least an intent. An effort by some European capitals to make sure that if Ukraine is further cut off from US assistance in the future, the effect on its battlefield performance is at least somewhat mitigated. But despite the efforts to reduce reliance on the United States over the course of 2025, even a year later, there are still areas where US supplies remain absolutely critical. This is why the PEARL, or Priority Ukrainian Requirements List initiative, is so significant. PEARL is basically a Ukrainian gifts registry for American equipment. The Ukrainians list the stuff from the states that they feel they urgently need, and then other countries donate to support purchases off that list. And consistently near the top of that list are American-manufactured PAC-3 interceptor missiles, with a major part of the why there coming back to one of the main threats to the Ukrainian war economy, Russia's continuing drone and missile campaign. That Russian effort has changed considerably over the last few years. In late 2022, a lot of Russia's missiles and drones were dedicated to attacks on the Ukrainian power grid, perhaps hoping that might inhibit the Ukrainian economy, or that enduring freezing temperatures through the winter might make the Ukrainian people themselves more likely to support a surrender. When that didn't work, in 2023, Russia changed strategy by focusing a lot of its missiles and drones on the Ukrainian power grid, before switching targets in 2024 to the Ukrainian power grid, and then in 2025 going into 2026, undertaking a bit of a strategic pivot by targeting the Ukrainian power grid, but doing it with even more missiles and drones than before. What you're seeing here is a graph put out by the CSAS, which charts Russian missile and drone attacks since February 2022 through to the beginning of 2026. And even just visually, the ramp up is fairly obvious. By one estimate, over the course of 2025, Russia launched about 54,000 long-range drones and 1,900 cruise and ballistic missiles against targets in Ukraine. The size of the individual strike packages intended to saturate or push through Ukrainian defences has also increased significantly since the start of the war. Whereas several years ago, Russia might launch a couple hundred drones in a month, during that January 20th strike, the Ukrainians claim the Russians launched 339 drones, along with 15 air-launched cruise and 18 ground-launched ballistic missiles. That said, despite this looking very much like a line-go-up situation on paper, if you dig a little deeper, there's more to it. At its core, the Russian long-range strike campaign has three basic components. The cheaper, low-capability systems, mostly the one-way attack drones, think Shaheds or the Gerber decoys, conventional cruise missiles, most of which are still launched from aircraft, but which can be launched by other platforms as well, and then finally, you have the high-cost, high-capability systems, ballistic missiles, and if you like, you could put hypersonics in this category as well. And while you can, and probably should, think of this as one combined Russian strike campaign, with drones and missiles acting together, from a technical and tactical standpoint, there have been very different challenges and dynamics to both. On the drone side, Ukraine's main challenges in 2025, likely to persist through 2026 when it comes to defending its economy, have been scale and constant technical adaptation. While the number of Russian drones launched was relatively stable in the second half of 2025, the Ukrainians have indicated they expect those numbers to jump further in 2026. And beyond just the raw numbers, we've seen this continuing rapid race between the Russians and Ukrainians to try and find ways to attack or defend more cost efficiently than the other side can. For example, you could argue that introducing these one-way attack drones in the first place gave Russia a way to try and put mass and cost effectiveness on its side. These Shahed-style drones from Iran were generally cheaper and available in larger numbers than the Ukrainian air defense missiles that were often being used to shoot them down. The Ukrainians responded by setting up mobile fire groups that were mostly reliant on heavy machine guns and autocannons, guided by a cheap integrated acoustic sensor system, and helped shift the shot exchange ratio back to the defender's side, because as cheap as you can make a one-way attack drone, it's probably not going to be cheaper than Pavel and his mates slinging lead from the back of a Toyota. So the Russians partly responded by increasing the complexity of the target. More powerful, sometimes even jet-powered Shahed-style drones that could fly at higher altitudes, making them easier to see for Ukrainian sensors, sure, but potentially putting them out of range of heavy machine gun fire on the ground, in turn prompting Ukraine to hunt for answers to augment the old mobile fire groups. One of those answers has been to go back to missiles for air defense, but to keep them as cheap as possible. What you're seeing on the right there, for example, is the Tempest, for lack of a better term, an air defense buggy. Think mobile road platform, a basic sensor system, and a rack for 2 Hellfire longbow missiles. Hellfire is a very, very long way from full-sized dedicated air defense missiles like the Patriot PAC-2, but it can fly higher and further than a 50 cal round. This is several times cheaper than stuff like Sidewinder and AMRAAM, let alone Patriot interceptors. Critically, that also puts it in roughly the same cost range as some of the blingier Russian Shahed variants. Meaning, once again, you have a relatively mobile, accessible solution that doesn't let the Russians aggressively wrestle that shot exchange ratio over to their side. Great. But ground-based systems can potentially be vulnerable to different versions of Russian attack drones. Ones which often keep the same basic layout, but now equipped with cameras, thermal sensors, and communications equipment to enable an operator to take control of it mid-flight, and use them to potentially go after air defense systems that might be threatening a larger formation. While this kind of adapted drone might be a threat to targets on the ground, what it obviously can't deal with, though, is air targets. And through 2025, we saw plenty of evidence of the Ukrainians leaning on air interception, particularly using their F-16s, to deal with these incoming drone swarms. A key milestone here is the apparent emergence, at least in limited quantities, of the APKWS guided rockets in Ukrainian service. Previously, most kills we've seen reported by Ukrainian F-16s on cruise missiles and drones have reportedly been either using AIM-9 Sidewinders, usually older versions, or the onboard cannon, which is cheap but risky for the aircraft, especially at night. Using laser-guided rockets like APKWS instead helps solve both the shot exchange problem and adds magazine depth. Now, an F-16 can carry multiple rockets per pylon, pull up behind a formation, use its targeting pod to designate them, and then start popping them with rockets that are going to cost tens of thousands of dollars each, rather than missiles that are going to cost hundreds of thousands. Clearly, the Russians are aware of the threat that targets like F-16 or Ukrainian helicopters might pose to their drones, and we've started to see some very creative attempts at countermeasures. What you're looking at here, for example, are the last seconds of a Russian Shahed-style drone before it's hit by a Ukrainian interceptor. And while it might not be obvious from the zoomed-in image, that white shape that you can see on top of the black-painted drone is an old Soviet R-60 short-range air-to-air missile. This render, which was released in Ukrainian media, should give you the rough idea of what you're looking at here. Basically, you take a one-way attack drone, put a launch rail from a fighter on top of it, and then you might mix it into a formation of attacking drones, functioning essentially as an escort fighter, if you will. The drone itself isn't going to have much in terms of sensors besides perhaps a basic camera, but if the operator can see a helicopter or jet harassing the drone formation, then they might at least be able to send a signal to launch the missile, relying on the seeker of the R-60 itself to do the work. By this stage, you're probably noticing a theme here. What started as relatively cheap, affordable one-way attack drones have steadily gotten blingier and more costly as we've gone on. We've added more powerful, sometimes jet-powered engines, new sensors, new cameras. Now we're bolting bloody anti-air missiles to the thing. But you've nonetheless potentially introduced a threat. What that kind of adaptation obviously isn't a good solution to is the one the Ukrainians seem to be honing in on the most, the interceptor drone. From essentially experimental novelty in early 2025, these things are now a mass-produced munition of choice. The Ukrainians claim they're now producing about 1,000 interceptors of various types per day, and Russian sources regularly complain about the things. We've seen Ukrainian figures suggest the plan is to continue scaling and improving the technology in this area, because there is a constant imperative to have interceptors outnumber attacking systems. As Zelensky publicly put it, quote, "If the Russians can use, for example, 1,000 drones, we must have at least 2 interceptors for each Shahed," end quote. From a Russian perspective, and for Ukrainians now dealing with Russian interceptors on the other side, countering these things has proven a bit more complicated. The core point is that the long-range drone campaign is a constant technical and production tug-of-war. If it hadn't been for the emergence and mass production of the interceptor drone, Ukraine would currently be in a much worse position. And how that effort plays out in 2026, and how much damage the Ukrainian economy has to suffer as a result, is ultimately going to come down to who can innovate and scale more effectively, the Russian attackers or the Ukrainian defenders. Defending against Russian missile attacks, though, is much more about international support. On the stats we have available, Russia generally hasn't done a very good job of scaling up its cruise missile attacks. The VKS main missile launch platforms obviously had a bit of a moment with the Ukrainian Operation Spiderweb, and launch volumes through much of 2025 were lower than what we saw earlier in the war. Russian ballistic missile attacks, though, have become more common, both potentially because the Russians appear to have had some success scaling up production of systems like Iskander, but also because of the availability of ballistic missiles from some of Russia's allies, most importantly, KN-23s from North Korea. Evidence like missile debris also indicates that the Russians might still be using long-range SAMs to pad out the attack numbers. On one hand, that's probably not a particularly efficient use of expensive surface-to-air missiles that are generally going to carry relatively small warheads. On the other hand, sometimes that's going to be what Russia has available, and SAMs in a ground attack mode can be very difficult targets to intercept. No matter how good your drone pilot is, a ballistic missile is not the kind of thing you're going to shoot down with an interceptor drone. If you want to stop it, you need a more complex interceptor, and for the moment, Ukraine can only get those from abroad. There are 2 interesting data points in recent Ukrainian claims that I think illustrate that point well. President Zelensky recently claimed that in defending against that Russian attack on January 20th, which included 18 ballistic, 15 cruise, and I believe 1 hypersonic missile, as well as 339 drones, Ukraine fired off about $88 million worth of air defense missiles. If we take those numbers as a given for a moment, I think it suggests the Ukrainians are not generally in the business of firing interceptors at Shaheds. They can't be, because if you're engaging even a fraction of 339 incoming threats that way, you'd quickly spend a lot more than 88 million. But it does suggest those complex interceptors are still a critical part of dealing with missile and especially ballistic missile attack. With Zelensky seeming to suggest that against Russian TBMs, the American PAC-3 interceptor is basically the only thing Ukraine has that works, which is where that question of geopolitical reliance and risk starts to come in. Because Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia and Russian drone and missile attacks on Ukraine are so common, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking the situation is inevitably stable. It's not. A change in scale or technology can lead to a lot more and potentially more damaging hits, as we saw with the Ukrainians going after Russia in 2025. And at the same time, Ukraine's defences are often under a constant supply squeeze, where the missiles necessary to fend off an attack might only be arriving weeks or days before it occurs. Even if we don't take, and I don't think we should, take Russia or Ukraine's interception rate claims as a given, if we look at the patterns, in this case on the Ukrainian side, you'll often see a lot of fluctuation. which might suggest that if an attack comes in at a time where stocks are good, the launchers are loaded, and the size of the attack isn't too big compared to the number of interceptors available, interception rates can be relatively high, especially for things like subsonic cruise missiles. But you can also see evidence of points where the system gets overstretched. A lot of missiles get through, and it's in those cases where the amount of damage done can significantly jump. In 2026 then, just as in the Russian case, I don't think most of the threat to the Ukrainian economy from drone missile attacks comes from high-end superweapons. Russia's much-vaunted Oreshnik, for example, has been used a grand total of twice, in both cases seemingly loaded with inert rather than conventional warheads. The risk instead to the Ukrainian air defense system, and by extension the Ukrainian economy, comes from a constant barrage of Russian missiles that are complex enough to require complex answers, but common enough to strain interceptor supplies from Ukraine's allies. Because a general pattern we've seen so far is whenever those supplies get overstretched, interception rates tend to fall, and we see chunks of Ukraine fall into darkness until that damage can be mitigated. The problem from a Russian strategic perspective, though, is there's a difference between being able to make the Ukrainian people miserable, shut off their heating, interrupt their water supply, make it very, very cold, and actually being able to inhibit the core war-relevant functions of the Ukrainian economy. Essentially, its ability to produce weapons, supply troops, and carry on the fight. So after that constant barrage of Russian drones, missiles, and glide bombs over the course of 2025, here's your chance to pencil in a guess of how much the Russians managed to shrink the Ukrainian economy by last year. Trick question. It grew by about 2% in real terms, depending on what estimate you take. The Ukrainians say about 2.2%, the European Central Bank projected about 1.6%, and the IMF somewhere between 2 and 3. Either way, that suggests that despite everything, the Ukrainian economy grew, in percentage terms, significantly faster than Russia's did. And while projections obviously vary, the general expectation is that that growth will continue or even accelerate going into 2026. At time of recording, the IMF estimates about 2% over the course of 2026, which in terms of growth performance would put Ukraine in between the United States and Eurozone and well clear of Russia. On paper, given the country's circumstances, that might sound great. But I do think it's something that needs to come with at least two massive asterisks to reflect the fact that this is growth generated by a war economy doing war economy things. The first is that just as with Russia, a lot of the cost here isn't in terms of raw short-term economic output, it's the destruction of capital and all of these longer-term costs. If Ukraine, for example, rebuilds an apartment building destroyed by a Russian missile, that counts as GDP. But even though you've created more output, you need to remember that you started the process with one apartment building and you ended it with one apartment building. As of January 2025, the total accumulated cost to rebuild Ukraine from all the damage caused by the war had already reached $500 billion. That's according to the UN's fourth Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment for Ukraine. And when we get updated figures this year to reflect the damage done through 2025, expect that $500 billion price tag to rise considerably. In the short term, that's probably not decisive for Ukraine's ability to continue fighting the war, but it does suggest there's an ever-growing price to be paid when this is all over. The other key asterisk is that Ukraine just can't afford the level of wartime spending that's currently happening that's juicing the economy along. The basic difference between Russia and Ukraine, though, is how Kyiv has gone about affording it. In Russia's case, the focus has been on drawing down assets, spending the National Wealth Fund, slicing down expenditure, and appropriating a few assets here and there. Meanwhile, for Ukraine, a critical part of the financial picture since the beginning has been foreign support. And in 2025, that experienced a major crisis. Even before the changeover in US administration, most financial assistance to Ukraine was coming from Europe, not the United States. And as you can see, by October last year, using that Kiel methodology, a pretty significant gap had opened between the two. But the main reason the ratio got to that point is because basically no additional US aid was forthcoming from the moment the White House changed hands. As you can see here, there was a massive surge in new US commitments in that October-December 2024 period, and then basically nothing. Europe then basically redoubled their efforts in the first half of 2025 to effectively cover the gap, but as we got into the second half of 2025, it was increasingly unclear what the financial plan here was if the war in Ukraine did stretch into 2026. The IMF calculated Ukraine's residual financing gap, basically how much additional money it needed to make its budget work, at about $136 billion for 2026 through 2029, and about $60 billion for 2026 through 2027 specifically. And that has to be financed from somewhere. As we got into December 2025, there were a significant number of voices in Europe arguing that that somewhere should be Moscow. Thanks to one of the great screw-ups of Russian pre-war planning, Europe was and is sitting on hundreds of billions of frozen Russian central bank assets. Just those frozen in Belgium, about 180 billion euros, would hypothetically be enough to cover that entire Ukrainian funding gap out through 2029. The challenge, of course, with directly or even indirectly accessing that pool of Russian frozen assets is that some nations might be concerned that if you take that step, you might be seen as a less safe place for others to park their assets in the future. Because, how can you possibly trust a bank that might take your money following years of tortured debate, you aggressively invading their neighbour, and then repeatedly refusing to stop? More seriously, the main opposition to the plan came from the country holding the bulk of those Russian assets, and thus, arguably, a lot of the legal and political risk. They pushed hard for an alternative, and in the end, an alternative is what we got. Instead of transferring about 140 billion euros worth of Russian state assets to Ukraine as a quote-unquote reparation loan, instead, the European Union would borrow 90 billion euros, transfer those to Ukraine, with the stated intention being that that loan only becomes repayable after the war is over from that pool of Russian assets that Europe is pushing for Ukraine to get as part of any peace deal. How the second part of that plan ultimately plays out remains to be seen, but in the here and now, it answered one of the major outstanding defence economics questions of this war: when, or if, Ukraine was going to run out of money to fight on. Coupled with other measures, like a bond restructure that we saw save Ukraine about $20 billion back in 2024, the answer to that question now appears to be no, or at least not this year. With that additional European commitment, even if no other funds are committed from anywhere else in the interim, Ukraine now pretty much has what it needs to run a wartime budget at least in 2026 and into 2027. And so even before the European measure had formally passed, the Ukrainians pulled the budgetary trigger on exactly that. The overall Ukrainian budget in 2026 is set to spend about $114 billion. That makes it about a fifth the size of the Russian budget, but a larger percentage of it is dedicated to the war effort. Depending on what elements of the Russian budget you include and what assumptions you choose to make, there the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian defence spending is closer to 3 to 1. That continues to leave Russia in a position of having a serious defence spending advantage, although a lot of that is going to go to stuff that's not directly related to the war in Ukraine. Think the Pacific and Northern fleets, the nuclear arsenal, internal security, etc., but historically perhaps not the kind of advantage you might expect an attacker to need in order to overcome a determined defender. On one hand, you could argue that strategically, this is a win for Ukraine, as they're likely to remain financially in the fight through 2026 and into 2027. But at the same time, I'd argue it just illustrates some of the missed strategic opportunity here. Over the course of the war, we've seen several major events that shift the amount of resources available to both sides. For Ukraine, aid packages being voted or shut off. For Russia, moments like North Korea choosing to open up their armories at a critical time, or at the other end of the spectrum, the oil price crashing, at the same time Ukrainian drones were crashing into the oil. But the broad overall resource relationship, at least when it came to financing for the war, has always remained roughly the same. Russia has consistently had more resources to spend, but never enough to obtain a decisive edge or overcome Ukraine's natural advantages as a defender and an innovator. And because that relative balance has remained consistent for years, even if the exact ratio has shifted back and forth over time, I think there's sometimes a tendency to think of it as inevitable. It's not. The difference between the original European plan and the compromise they ultimately settled on was about 50 billion euros. Divide that over 2 years, we'll call it 25 billion euros. Meanwhile, when the United States was still appropriating new aid for Ukraine, it was doing it at a rate of roughly 60 billion US dollars per year. Only a fraction of that was actually going to Ukraine as financial or military aid. So just for the sake of illustration, let's call it 40 billion US dollars to Ukraine per year. If you just change 2 strategic data points, the Europeans go with the original proposal rather than the compromise, and you'd maintained a flow of about 40 billion a year from the United States to Kyiv, then all else being equal, Ukraine's funding picture looks better to the tune of about $70 billion per year. You're no longer talking about a 3 to 1 advantage for Moscow, you're getting closer to parity. The reason I bring all this up is to illustrate 2 core points. The first is that from a fiscal perspective, Ukraine now likely has what it needs to continue through 2026 and into 2027, and if nothing else changes significantly, its spending ratio against Russia shouldn't change dramatically. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember just how fragile that balance is. The great concern for Kyiv is always going to be that its allies turn off the financial support tap, without which there's no way to make the Ukrainian wartime budget work. Meanwhile, the challenge from Moscow's perspective is that as long as that funding does continue, there's really no practical way to run the Ukrainian budget dry. If the Russians can't expect to break the Ukrainian budget though, going through our list, that leaves at least 2 potential primary targets: Ukraine's military potential and its domestic stability, the will of its population. And I think that second point's especially worth discussing because the sheer amount of resources Russia appears to have dedicated to targeting it. Russia has used its missile and drones to go after a whole range of Ukrainian targets. We see Iskander being used against valuable pieces of military equipment. Cruise and ballistic missiles do go after things like command centres, training grounds, or known Ukrainian military production facilities. But an enormous amount of Russian ordnance that could potentially have been deployed against military targets has been essentially face-tanked by Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. which, given the persistence of these attacks and the nominal precision of these weapons, indicates that Russian planners are potentially making a conscious decision here, that turning off the lights and heating, especially during the coldest months of the year, is a better use of their salvos than concentrating more on military targets. And make no mistake, they are succeeding in making life exceptionally difficult for many in Ukraine. Imagine pensioners in unheated apartment buildings at temperatures well below freezing. But I imagine one of the main strategic questions about this effort now is the same as it was back in 2022. Is making life miserable for millions of Ukrainians a viable military method to get them to capitulate? And so far, the answer has always been no. Going into 2025, there were some reports in the media that sounded the alarm about Ukrainian public support potentially fracturing. The article on the right there from August, for example, ran the headline, quote, "Ukrainian support for war effort collapses," end quote, with the relevant statistic now being that a majority of Ukrainians supported a negotiated attempt to end the fighting. Just as with those same statistics for the Russian population, though, the devil was very much in the detail. A majority of Ukrainians supported a negotiated peace, but nothing like the kind of peace that Moscow had indicated it would be willing to accept. This polling data from late 2025 suggests that if you ask Ukrainians whether they'd be willing to accept a peace, that leaves Russia in at least temporary control of occupied Ukrainian territory, but doesn't recognise those gains as part of Russia, those who oppose that solution narrowly outnumber those who say they might be able to accept it, roughly 56 to 44. But if you change that to a scenario where Ukraine now has to accept those territories like the Donbass as legally part of Russia, despite everything these people have been going through for years at this point, support absolutely craters. And from a Russian perspective, it's worth noting that recently, the data appears to have been going in the wrong direction. Between January 2022 and January 2024, we saw a steady increase in the number of Ukrainian respondents, indicating they'd be willing to countenance some territorial concessions to Russia. But going into 2025, that number actually fell back a bit. And all that's without accounting for the fact that the Russian demands actually go well beyond what's even being polled here, with those demands extending to the legal ownership of some territories they don't even presently occupy. An apt summary here, then, is the Ukrainians are tired of the war. At time of recording, in many cities across Ukraine, many of them have been without power, without heating, and would probably like nothing more than to go back to a normal, safe life. But from all the polling we've seen, they're not willing to surrender to Russia's conditions in order to get peace. This polling on the right here, which actually put more specific peace proposals to members of the public, indicates pretty clearly that what you might describe as a Russia-friendly option is, in polling terms, dead on arrival. And instead, the kind of proposal where you might get a majority in Ukraine across the line is a scenario where, in their example, the front line is frozen without those territories being legally recognised as Russian. Ukraine is able to move towards joining the European Union, sanctions in Russia remain in place while additional negotiations play out, and potentially most importantly, Ukraine receives reliable security guarantees from both Europe and the United States. And from everything we've seen so far, even if it would cement some Russian gains in practice, that doesn't appear to be the kind of deal that Russia would be willing to accept. There are, of course, caveats to these numbers. There's a difference between a majority of the public saying they'd rather continue fighting than surrendering, and people being willing to go to the front lines and fight. As we've discussed in the past, Ukraine has ongoing manpower issues, covering everything from recruitment to issues like troops going AWOL, and we'll explore that in a future episode. History also suggests it's possible for major events to shift opinion. But from most of the polling I've seen so far, one of the biggest Ukrainian political earthquakes of 2025, a corruption scandal that ultimately brought down a number of Ukrainian figures, including Andriy Yermak, doesn't appear to have shaken the willingness of most Ukrainians to fight on. And frankly, a number of the Ukrainians I spoke to are just happy Yermak is gone. Which brings me to this last piece of polling data, which essentially asks Ukrainians how much longer they're willing to endure the war for. In December 2023, 73% of respondents said for as long as necessary. After another year of hard fighting, the number dropped to 57%, with most of the others either not answering or setting a timeline on their endurance. And yet, by December 2025, the percentage of respondents saying they were willing to go as long as it took was back up again to 62%. Some broad closing observations then, going into 2026, would probably go something like this. 2025 was difficult for the economies and populations on both sides, with the Russian economy suffering proportionally a greater slowdown, while the Ukrainian population was the one enduring much greater hardship. But even as the war stretches into another year, both Russia and Ukraine appear to be holding their war economies together. In that respect, 2026 is likely to have plenty of critical pivot points. Negotiations and international support are likely to be critical, as is that constant race to inflict as much damage on the opponent's economy as possible, while taking as little damage as possible in turn. But unless something dramatic changes, which is always possible, especially in 2026, the conditions seem to be there on both home fronts to enable the war to continue, which makes it all the more important that in a coming episode, we look at the other potential point of failure, But that military dimension, the domain of attrition, replacements, and remaining military endurance, that's something we're going to have to come back to in a future episode. And so with that, let me give a channel update to close out. And just to flag the obvious, I'm very aware, like I'm sure all of you are, that 2026 has been a very eventful year so far. As I flagged in the introduction, I'm going to try and examine some of those events in the near future, but what I and the patrons who voted on this topic really didn't want to happen was for those recent events to distract from the war in Ukraine reaching this rather grim milestone, and making sure it was given its analytic due. I think what hopefully comes through in the data is that as far as the economies were concerned, 2025 was a very expensive year of war for both Ukraine and Russia. But at the same time, while there are plenty of risks and unknowns still in play for both sides, as it stands, neither looks to be cracking on the home front. Just please remember that when I'm presenting polling data or macroeconomic statistics, there are, for example, people in those cities having to live through a cold and dangerous winter, often without power. Thank you all, as always, for your ongoing support and engagement, and with any luck, I'll see you again next week.